Why does $18 make a man in a black SUV outside a roadside diner go completely silent? Like someone just turned off the world. The waitress stared at the folded bill in her shaking fingers, its ink smudged with rain and grease, resting beside a chipped ceramic plate and a tipped receipt printer still blinking red. Outside the glass, headlights cut through the storm. 10 SUVs idling without engines, like predators holding their breath. Inside, the apron around her waist was damp, stained with coffee and something darker she hadn't noticed until now. Her old diner headset crackled once, then died. Nobody spoke. Even the fryer behind her had gone quiet, as if the kitchen itself was listening. 3 hours earlier, the diner smelled like burnt oil and cheap syrup, the kind of place that never truly closed, only slowed down enough for people to forget they were still awake. She was wiping down the counter in slow circles, counting tips in her head like prayer, $3, $2, a handful of coins, and that last fragile 18 folded too carefully to be random. Her younger brother's hospital bill was due in 6 days. The landlord had already stopped pretending patience. "You're bleeding time you don't have," her supervisor had said earlier with a smile too clean to be kind, tapping her tip jar like it belonged to him more than her. He always spoke softly, politely, like cruelty needed manners to be legal. She didn't answer. She never did. She just watched. She noticed things others didn't. Like the woman in booth 7 who hadn't touched her food, only held her child too tightly, or the man in the corner who kept checking the parking lot instead of the menu. That was when she made the decision she didn't think about. She slid the $18 across the table. "No hesitaste. No calculaste." Just movement. "For the medicine," she said quietly, before the woman could refuse. 3 seconds later, the supervisor's smile sharpened. "That wasn't yours to give," he said. Still polite, still calm, like he was correcting grammar instead of breaking something inside her. She kept wiping the counter, kept breathing. But when she turned, the man in the far booth, silent, still dressed, too clean for a place like this, was watching her hands, not her face. He hadn't ordered anything, hadn't blinked in a while. And when she accidentally met his eyes, she felt something wrong in the silence between them, like he had already counted every movement she would make next. She didn't know his name, didn't know the 2 men outside the diner weren't waiting for a ride, but for permission. The supervisor leaned closer again, voice still soft enough to pass for kindness. "People like you shouldn't confuse generosity with authority," he whispered. That was when the man in the booth finally moved. Just slightly, just enough for the light to catch the edge of a black phone on the table. The screen was already recording, and on it, the $18 bill she had given away appeared again. This time tagged with a code she had never seen before, pulsing faintly like it had been waiting for her all along. The screen on the black phone didn't stop recording, even when no one touched it. The waitress stared at it like it had started breathing on its own. The $18 bill still frozen in frame, the hidden code pulsing faintly beneath the ink like a heartbeat that didn't belong to money. Outside the glass, one of the SUVs shifted a few inches forward, then stopped again, as if even the tires were waiting for permission. Inside, the diner returned to its fake normal, frying oil, humming neon, the dishwasher clanking plates in a rhythm too steady to feel human. But everything now felt slightly misaligned, like the world had been tilted and nobody else noticed. The supervisor walked past her again, brushing a hand near the tip register. Too casual, too practiced. "You should stop looking at things that don't concern you," he said softly, like advice instead of warning. She didn't answer. She couldn't stop looking, because the shift log behind the counter had been changed. Her name moved 30 minutes forward, then back again, like someone was editing time to hide a mistake that wasn't supposed to exist. A second key card beeped at the office door moments later, though no one used it. She saw it on the small security monitor. Someone entering the manager's room without swiping, without identity, without noise. The coffee machine spat out 2 receipts instead of 1 for a table that only ever seated 1 person, and both receipts carried the same table number that no longer matched the seating chart taped to the wall. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her apron when she noticed the stain again. The faint mark where the system code had burned into the fabric, now darker than before, like it had learned where she worked and decided to stay. In the reflection of the stainless steel counter, she saw the woman from booth 7 again, but this time the woman wasn't sitting. She was gone, leaving only a hospital bracelet on the table, the kind used for emergency intake, still damp like it had been worn too recently to forget. The waitress picked it up instinctively, reading the name without meaning to, and felt her stomach tighten. The supervisor's voice softened further, almost gentle now, as he leaned toward the register. "That woman was never here," he said. But she remembered her. She remembered the child's cough, the way the bill was split, the way the man in the corner booth never ate but always watched the door. Her phone vibrated once in her apron pocket. Old, cracked screen lighting up with a notification from her bank. $18 pending reversal, origin unknown. At the same time, a deleted voicemail icon reappeared on the diner's landline system, time-stamped for a call that was never made, the playback button already grayed out. A faint scent of expensive cologne drifted through the kitchen doorway, too clean for grease and fryer oil, and when she turned slightly, she saw a dark coat hanging near the staff exit that did not belong to any employee, its collar still holding heat as if someone had just stepped out of it seconds ago. The mafia boss finally spoke again, but not to her, only to the air between machines and people, his voice quiet enough that it felt like it belonged to the room itself. "Check the footage from the side exit at 7:42, he said. The supervisor smiled immediately. "Already gone," he replied, too fast. That was when she noticed the timestamp on the kitchen clock didn't match the receipt printer anymore. And the difference was exactly 18 minutes, and on the counter beside her hand, a second copy of the $18 bill appeared. Dry this time, as if it had never been touched by rain at all. The second copy of the $18 bill didn't feel like paper anymore. Felt intentional. The waitress held it under the flickering kitchen light, watching the same faint code shimmer beneath the ink, except now the edges were sharper, like the system had decided to correct itself instead of disappear. The mafia boss stood near the side exit monitor, his reflection broken across the black glass, eyes fixed on a frozen timestamp that read 7:42 p.m., but showed nothing moving inside the frame. "Run it again," he said quietly. The supervisor answered too quickly. "Already corrupted. Old system. Happens sometimes in cheap places." His smile stayed in place, but his hand had moved, just slightly, toward the drawer under the register, like muscle memory trying to hide something before it could be seen. The waitress noticed it. Not the fear, the habit. 3 hours earlier still didn't feel real when she replayed it in her mind, because time here had already started bending in small, precise ways. The receipt in her hand from booth 7 didn't match the kitchen log. It showed a coffee order for 2, but she remembered only 1 cup being poured. She remembered the woman holding the child, not speaking, not eating, just shaking. And she remembered the empty chair across from her that had felt occupied without anyone sitting in it. Now that chair had no record at all. The boss stepped closer to the monitor, not touching it, only studying the frozen grain of footage like it might confess if he stared long enough. "There should be a second angle," he said. "Not a question. Correction to reality." The supervisor exhaled through his nose, polite, controlled. "Side camera's been down for maintenance all week. I told corporate." The waitress heard the lie before she understood it. Not because of what he said, but because of how carefully he said it, like each word had been rehearsed to survive inspection. She moved to the counter, placing the $18 bill next to the receipt, aligning them edge to edge. The ink codes didn't match exactly anymore. One had shifted slightly, as if reacting to proximity. Her fingers tightened. "That's not true," she said softly. The room didn't react immediately, as if it needed permission to acknowledge her voice. The supervisor turned toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sweetheart, you're tired. You've been on your feet too long." He said it gently, like concern, like kindness wrapped around a blade. But she shook her head once. "I closed section B at 7:38, not 7:42. Silence tightened. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to pause. The mafia boss finally looked at her. Not at the supervisor, not at the screen, but at her hands. "You're certain," he said. Not disbelief. Measurement. She nodded. Because I refilled the syrup at 7:40. The bottle was still half full when I came back from table 7. The supervisor laughed lightly, too fast. We don't track syrup bottles. But he had just confirmed the time without meaning to. The boss didn't move. He only tilted his head slightly, like the room had just introduced a contradiction worth remembering. Then the waitress did something she didn't plan. She reached into her apron and pulled out her old phone. The screen was cracked, but the call log was still visible. One entry, deleted voicemail restored without permission. Timestamp, 7:41 p.m. No caller ID. Just static audio preview. The supervisor's expression tightened for half a second before smoothing again. Too late. The boss saw it. Not the phone. The reaction. Play it, he said quietly. The waitress hesitated only once before pressing it. The voicemail didn't contain a voice. It contained a sound, 3 electronic beeps followed by a single phrase repeated in a system tone she had never heard before. Asset movement confirmed at wrong table. The supervisor stepped forward immediately. That's not ours. That's not even. He stopped himself too late, because the waitress had already placed the receipt beside the phone, and now both were vibrating faintly in sync, as if recognizing each other across different forms of evidence. The mafia boss finally turned his gaze to the supervisor fully. No anger yet, just alignment. Why does your system speak like it knows her name? He asked. And for the first time, the supervisor didn't answer fast enough. That was when the waitress noticed the final detail. The table number on the receipt had changed again, but only for her eyes, and now it matched the exact chair where the woman with the child had been sitting. Even though there was no record she ever existed at all. The mafia boss didn't move when the room shifted around him. He only looked at the waitress's phone as the final line of the voicemail replayed itself again without her pressing anything. Asset movement confirmed at wrong table. Like the system had decided she was no longer allowed to stop hearing it. The supervisor stepped forward immediately, smiling with careful precision. This is getting out of hand, he said gently, as if calming a misunderstanding rather than containing a collapse. She's confused. Night shifts do that to people. The waitress felt the air tighten around her apron. The fabric suddenly too visible, too small for the space she was standing in. Behind her, the kitchen door swung open and 2 staff members entered carrying fresh menus for the late seating. High-end print, embossed lettering, the kind of place where paper itself was expensive. One of them paused when they saw her. Not surprise. Adjustment. Like her presence didn't fit the updated layout of the room. You should wait outside, the maitre d' said politely, not looking at her face for more than a second. We're handling a client matter. The words were soft, rehearsed, and absolute. The waitress didn't move. She placed the receipt down on the counter again, aligning it exactly with the edge of the metal surface, as if precision could keep it from being erased. It's the wrong table number, she said quietly. It changed after she left. Twice. The supervisor laughed lightly, the sound controlled and almost friendly. That's not how systems work. But he didn't look at the receipt when he said it. The mafia boss finally shifted his attention, not to the supervisor, not to the staff, but to the maitre d' who had just spoken. Who updated seating assignments after 7:40? He asked. Calm. Measured. Not accusation yet, inventory. The maitre d' hesitated just long enough for it to feel expensive. We don't manually adjust guest logs during service hours, he replied. It's automated. The boss nodded once, as if noting a discrepancy in a ledger only he could see. The waitress watched this exchange carefully, her fingers tightening around the edge of her apron where the faint system stain still lingered. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was just refusing to disappear. A second staff member stepped forward, younger, nervous, holding a tablet slightly too close to their chest. Sir, they said carefully, addressing the boss now. If there's a concern, we can file a formal review after close. Right now we have a full section waiting for. No one is waiting, the boss interrupted quietly. The sentence didn't rise. It fell. The room adjusted to it instantly. Even the supervisor stopped smiling correctly. The waitress noticed something then. How quickly the staff had started speaking around her instead of to her, as if acknowledging her directly might contaminate the narrative they were building. The maitre d' gently extended a hand toward her receipt. "We'll need that for documentation." It wasn't forceful. It was procedural. Clean. Final. She hesitated. Not because she didn't understand, but because she did. If she handed it over, it would become theirs. She placed her palm over it instead. "It has the wrong timestamp," she said again, softer now, but sharper underneath. 7:42 never happened the way you wrote it. A flicker crossed the supervisor's face. Gone instantly, replaced with patience. "Sweetheart," he said, almost kind, "you're describing patterns in noise." The boss looked at the receipt again, then at the phone, then at the waitress's apron. "She's not describing," he said quietly. "She's comparing." That was when the system made its mistake. The tablet in the younger staff member's hands refreshed automatically, and for half a second log appeared beneath the official one. Unredacted, unapproved, impossible to explain. Table 7. 2 occupants. 1 removed from record. Timestamp: 7 hours 41 minutes and 58 seconds. The staff member froze. The supervisor saw 2. And for the first time, his voice didn't sound rehearsed. "That shouldn't be visible," he said softly. Not denial. Correction. The waitress didn't smile. She didn't react loudly. She only exhaled once, like something inside her had finally stopped asking permission to exist. The mafia boss didn't speak immediately. He simply watched the supervisor's hand move slightly toward the tablet, not to hide it this time, but to understand how it had already been seen. And in that silence, the smallest thing in the room became the loudest. The system had just revealed something it was never supposed to admit, and it had done it in front of her. The silence in the diner didn't break when the tablet refreshed again. It tightened, like the room had just realized it was being watched by something it couldn't edit fast enough. The hidden log remained on screen for less than 2 seconds before the system attempted to overwrite it, but the mafia boss had already seen it. His eyes didn't move immediately. He simply stayed on the number. 7 hours 41 minutes and 58 seconds. Then on the word removed. The supervisor reacted first, too quickly again. "That's a cache error," he said, stepping between the screen and the table like his body could physically block data. "We get those after updates." "It's nothing." The waitress didn't speak. She reached slowly into her apron and pulled out something the others hadn't seen yet. A folded section of the printed shift ledger, torn carefully from the back office binder. Not stolen. Saved. Her fingers were steady now in a way they hadn't been earlier. "This is the original log," she said quietly. "Before it was rewritten." The paper hit the counter with a sound softer than it should have been, but heavier than anything else in the room. The supervisor exhaled a small laugh, almost amused. "You took paperwork from the office?" he asked, shaking his head. "That's a violation, you know?" But his eyes didn't stay on her. They kept flicking to the mafia boss, measuring reaction instead of truth. The boss didn't respond immediately. He picked up the torn ledger page, holding it only between 2 fingers, like it might contaminate him if held too long. The ink was different. 2 different hands. 2 different timestamps. 1 clean line over another that had been partially scraped out, not erased. "Why is there a second correction mark here?" he asked softly. The supervisor smiled again, but it was thinner now. "Because someone wrote it wrong the first time." The waitress stepped forward half a step. Not toward him, toward the truth sitting on the counter. "I didn't write anything," she said. "I only closed table 7. I signed out at 7:38. This says 7:41. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The mismatch already carried weight. The boss finally looked at her directly again, not as an employee, not as noise in the system, but as the only consistent element in a broken record. "Who else had access to the back office at that time?" he asked. The supervisor answered immediately. "Too clean. Too prepared. Everyone on shift has access. It's a shared system." Pause followed, but it wasn't empty. It was calculated. The boss set the ledger down beside the receipt and the phone. 3 objects now forming a line no one had planned. Cash, record, and voice. The waitress noticed something new then, the faint smell on the supervisor's jacket when he leaned too close to the counter. Not diner grease. Something sharper. Perfume. Expensive. Familiar. She didn't accuse. She only said, "You weren't in the kitchen at 7:41. The supervisor's smile finally slipped for a fraction of a second. "I was speaking to corporate on the phone," he replied smoothly. "Check the call log." The boss tilted his head slightly. "Show it." A beat, then another. The supervisor reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, turning the screen outward. Call log visible. Clean. 1 outgoing call at 7:40 lasting 12 minutes. Perfect alignment. Too perfect. The waitress stared at it longer than she meant to. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "That's not your phone." The room shifted instantly. Not loudly. Precisely. The supervisor laughed once, short and controlled. "Excuse me?" The waitress stepped closer to the counter, pointing not at the screen, but at the cracked corner of the device. "Your phone has a scratch near the charging port," she said. "I saw it yesterday when you dropped it near Fryer 2. Silence dropped hard enough that even the refrigerator seemed to hesitate. The supervisor's grip tightened slightly. "You're mistaken," he said, but it came slower now. The mafia boss extended his hand. "Give it to me." The request wasn't forceful. It was final. The supervisor hesitated just long enough to matter, then placed the phone on the counter. The boss turned it once in his hand. Same model, same case, almost identical, but the screen brightness adjusted differently under his thumb. "Where is yours?" he asked without looking up. The supervisor didn't answer immediately, and in that delay, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for the waitress to notice the smallest fracture in his control. And for the first time, the boss looked at him not as a manager, not as a function of the diner, but as a man who had just been caught with a version of reality that didn't belong to him. The phone on the counter didn't belong to him anymore. The mafia boss held it like it had already confessed something, turning it slowly under the diner's harsh fluorescent light. The supervisor stood perfectly still now, but the stillness wasn't calm, it was controlled collapse. Outside, rain slid down the glass in thin vertical lines, and the parked SUVs remained unmoving, their presence heavier than engines. Inside, the waitress felt the weight of something shifting. Not loud, not explosive, but precise, like a lock turning in a door no one had been told existed. The boss didn't look up when he spoke. "Pull every internal access log from the last 72 hours, he said quietly. Not to the supervisor, not to the room, to someone already on the line. A pause. Then a voice through his earpiece confirmed without emotion. The supervisor finally tried to reclaim control with a small breath. "You're escalating a misunderstanding," he said gently, as if speaking to a reasonable guest. "This is a staffing issue, nothing more." The waitress stood at the counter, hands resting lightly near the torn ledger page. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. Instead, she placed something else beside it. A folded hospital invoice, creased from being carried too long in her apron. Her brother's name was on it. The balance was not. "They used this to tell me I owed them time," she said softly. "Every shift I missed, they added it here." The supervisor's eyes flicked down to it and away immediately, as if looking too long might make it real. The diner behind them continued its false rhythm. Plates clinking, fryer hissing, neon buzzing faintly against the rain. But the sound now felt distant, like the room itself was stepping back to avoid being implicated. The mafia boss picked up the invoice. His eyes scanned it once, then again slower. "This is not a diner record," he said. It wasn't a question. The supervisor exhaled a short laugh. "She's confused. That's personal debt. She's mixing systems." But his voice had changed slightly now, less polished, more pressured. The boss didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly toward the kitchen doorway. "Open the back-end server logs," he said into his earpiece. A pause. Then another voice, different, sharper, answered. Sir, these logs are mirrored off-site. Someone has been syncing them manually. The waitress looked up at that. Not fear. Recognition. That's why the times kept changing, she said quietly. They weren't broken. They were being rewritten. The supervisor stepped forward a fraction, just enough to be seen as reasonable again. We're talking about an $18 misplacement and a tired employee misreading schedules, he said carefully. This is being blown into something it isn't. The mafia boss finally looked at him directly again. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was measured. Then show me your original shift file, he said. The supervisor hesitated. Only for a second. But it was there. That second did not belong in a clean system. He moved toward the office door. Too smooth. Too practiced. The waitress noticed something else then. The way his hand brushed the inside of his jacket before he opened the door, like confirming something was still there. The boss saw it too. He didn't stop him. He simply said, almost softly, "You've been very confident for someone whose records keep rewriting themselves." The supervisor froze for half a beat, then continued walking. Inside the office, drawers opened too quickly. Paper shuffled. A chair scraped. The waitress stayed still, but her fingers tightened on the edge of the hospital invoice as if it was the only thing preventing the room from sliding further out of alignment. The boss stepped closer to her. Not protective, not reassuring. Observing. "You didn't steal anything," he said quietly. "It wasn't comfort. It was correction." She shook her head once. "I just didn't let them take it first." A faint vibration came from his phone. One message. Then another. He didn't look immediately. When he did, his expression didn't change. But something behind it tightened. A name had appeared in the access trace. Someone he had trusted for years. Someone who had signed off on the system updates without question. The waitress didn't know the name on the screen, but she saw the shift in him, the moment certainty lost its shape. The supervisor returned with a printed sheet, placing it down with careful confidence. "Here," he said. "Everything matches." The boss looked at the paper, then at the invoice, then at the waitress's apron, where the faint system stain still refused to disappear. And for the first time, his silence wasn't about observation anymore. It was about realization. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." The supervisor's printed sheet didn't move when the air in the room shifted again. It just sat there on the counter like it was waiting to be believed. The mafia boss didn't touch it. He didn't need to. His eyes were already elsewhere. On the timestamp mismatch, on the waitress's hospital invoice, on the faint hesitation still lingering in the supervisor's posture like a stain that couldn't be wiped clean. Outside, the rain had thickened, turning the diner windows into distorted mirrors of flickering neon and parked SUVs that now felt closer than before. Inside, the boss finally spoke again, his voice even, almost quiet enough to disappear into the hum of the refrigerator. "Run the original shift log," he said. "Not to the supervisor. Not to anyone in the room. To the unseen system beyond it." Pause followed. Then another voice through his earpiece. "Confirmed access was granted, but incomplete. Logs are being overwritten in real time," the voice added. The waitress felt that sentence more than she heard it. Real time meant now. Not past. Not error. Now. She stepped closer to the counter, not because she was told, but because she refused to stay behind it. "If it's rewriting itself," she said softly, "then it's not broken. It's controlled." The supervisor turned toward her immediately, polite smile still intact but thinner at the edges. "You don't understand how enterprise systems work," he said gently. "You're interpreting noise as pattern." The mafia boss didn't look at him. "Show me the diner's internal camera feed from 7:41 to 7:43, he said instead. The supervisor blinked once. "That feed is archived." "Retrieve it," the boss replied. No rise in tone. No pressure. Just finality. A staff member at the back terminal hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The screen loaded slowly, buffering like something resisting memory. The waitress watched the loading wheel spin. She remembered something then. Not dramatic, not hidden, just precise. The clock above Friar 2 was off by 3 minutes yesterday, she said quietly. I reset it at closing. It was still wrong today. No one reacted immediately, but the boss did. A small pause, a recognition of detail instead of emotion. The screen finally loaded. Grainy footage, kitchen angle, table 7, empty, then occupied, then empty again in a blink too fast to feel natural. The supervisor stepped forward. Faster now. Glitch, he said. Compression artifact. But his voice had changed. Slightly raised. Slightly less controlled. The boss leaned in, studying frame by frame. Not reacting, just collecting. Pause at 7 hours 41 minutes and 58 seconds, he said. The screen froze. The waitress felt her breath tighten. Not from fear, but from recognition. Something was missing in the frame. Not a person. Not movement. Time itself looked edited. The boss pointed once. Where is the second chair shadow? Silence. The question landed harder than accusation. The supervisor didn't answer immediately. That delay again, the same fracture pattern the waitress had noticed before. The staff member at the terminal tried to correct the feed manually. The screen flickered, then froze again. A faint notification popped up in the corner. File integrity restored externally. The boss straightened slightly. Not surprised. Confirming. Someone is editing this while we watch it, he said. The waitress reached slowly into her apron and pulled out the original receipt from booth 7 again, placing it beside the frozen screen. The table number matched the footage exactly now, but only because both had been altered to match each other. It keeps changing to agree with itself, she said. The supervisor exhaled sharply. This is absurd. You're turning system latency into conspiracy. But he didn't look at the screen anymore. He was looking at the exit. The boss noticed that too. You're not worried about the footage, he said quietly. You're worried about what's inside it. A beat. The rain pressed harder against the glass. Somewhere in the back office, a drawer closed too fast. The terminal behind the counter suddenly flashed a new log entry without input. Manual override attempted. Denied. Then another. Identity mismatch detected. The waitress didn't fully understand what she was seeing, but she understood enough. The system wasn't failing. It was resisting exposure. The supervisor finally spoke, softer now. If you continue this, you'll be opening doors that don't belong in a diner investigation. The boss turned his head slightly. Then stop trying to close them, he said. And for the first time, the supervisor didn't respond immediately, not because he had nothing to say, but because he realized too many systems were now watching him respond. The waitress stood still as the screen flickered again, but this time the freeze frame showed something new that hadn't been there before. A faint outline of a third person at table 7, too blurred to identify, too centered to ignore. And in that moment, the supervisor understood. Not the full truth, not yet, but enough to know the waitress was no longer standing alone in any version of the system that still worked. The room stopped behaving like a diner the moment the hidden outline appeared on the frozen footage again, too centered, too intentional, too human to be a glitch. The supervisor stood in front of the screen now, but not because he had control, because he had nowhere else to stand. The mafia boss didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Bring the full backup archive, not the edited one." The sentence didn't carry threat, carried finality. A staff member hesitated at the terminal, fingers shaking slightly as they navigated deeper layers of the system no one was supposed to access during service hours. The waitress stood behind them, holding something she had never let go of since part 1. The original receipt from table 7, now folded so many times the edges had softened like worn paper skin. "Stop trying to align it," she said quietly. "It only changes when you try to fix it." No one responded. But the boss looked at her then, really looked like he was recalibrating what kind of presence she was inside a system designed to ignore her. The backup loaded. Slowly. Not corrupted. Not missing. Just waiting. The screen filled with a different version of 741 to 743. This time, the third figure at table 7 was no longer an outline. It was clear enough to recognize movement, clear enough to recognize intent, and clear enough to recognize the supervisor standing exactly where he claimed he had never been. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was compression, like the room itself was being forced into a smaller shape. The supervisor stepped forward immediately. "That's not accurate," he said, but his voice had lost its softness. "That feed was edited externally. You're looking at a manipulated restore." The mafia boss didn't answer. He leaned closer to the screen, watching frame by frame as the waitress herself stepped into the footage. Not as an error, not as noise, but as the only person moving consistently through both versions of time. The waitress exhaled once. "That's the moment I handed her the $18, she said quietly. But that's not what happened after. She reached into her apron again and placed something else on the counter. Smaller than everything else, almost invisible until light hit it correctly. A folded internal memo stamped with diner management. Letterhead. Not hers. Not staff level. Supervisor level clearance. The boss picked it up. His eyes scanned once, then stopped. The document authorized temporary removal of non-compliant transaction witnesses at Table 7 during shift 740 to 745, signed with a name that didn't match the supervisor's current identity, a different signature style, a different ink tone, a different authority. The waitress didn't speak. She didn't need to. She only pointed once at the timestamp on the memo. "That's the same window where she disappeared from the log," she said. The supervisor laughed once, but it was hollow now. "You're building narrative out of coincidence," he said, but his hand had started shaking. The boss didn't look at him. He looked at the signature again. Longer this time. Something in his expression changed. Not anger, not surprise, but recognition that came too late to feel clean. "This authorization uses my internal cipher," he said quietly. The room tightened. Even the refrigerator sound seemed to drop a register. The supervisor froze, just for a fraction of a second. But enough. The waitress saw it. The boss saw it. That was the fracture. The boss finally set the memo down beside the receipt and the hospital invoice, forming a line no one had designed but everyone now understood. He removed his watch slowly, placing it on the counter as if time itself was now under review. Then he looked at the supervisor, not as an employee, not as a problem, but as something inside his system that he had allowed to operate too long without inspection. "You didn't just alter logs," he said quietly. "You used my clearance to erase people." The supervisor opened his mouth, but no sound came out immediately. And in that silence, the waitress didn't look at the money, the SUVs, or the authority anymore. She only looked at the space where the woman from Table 7 had been erased from existence, and for the first time that absence finally had a name the system could not overwrite. The boss's hand rested on the counter, still, precise, controlled, but when he spoke again, it wasn't to the supervisor. It was to the room that had been lying to him for too long. "Call my attorney." The first thing that changed was not the sentence, not the arrest, not the call, it was the silence after the boss said it. "Call my attorney." It didn't echo. It settled. Like the diner itself had finally accepted it could no longer rewrite what was happening inside it. Outside, the rain softened into a steady wash against the glass, and the 10 SUVs remained parked, no longer waiting, no longer threatening, just present, as if the world outside had already been informed that the rules inside were no longer local. The supervisor stood frozen near the counter, his earlier confidence now reduced to something thin and carefully maintained. No one spoke to him. Not the staff. Not the system terminal. Not even the screen, which had stopped refreshing entirely. The mafia boss didn't look at him anymore. He looked at the waitress. "Your name," he said quietly, "was never entered correctly." She blinked once. That sentence landed differently than everything before it. Not accusation. Not validation. Correction. The waitress stepped forward and placed the original receipt, the hospital invoice, and the torn ledger page in a straight line on the counter. "It was never meant to be," she said. "That's why it kept changing." The boss nodded once, as if that answered a question he had been carrying longer than this room had existed. A lawyer arrived within minutes. Not rushed, not chaotic, but already informed. He didn't ask what happened. He simply began photographing, scanning, collecting. The supervisor finally tried to speak again. "This is being misinterpreted," he said carefully. "There are procedural explanations for all of this." But no one responded to him directly anymore. The lawyer opened a tablet and displayed a mirrored ledger network. Entries marked, corrected, erased. Entire shifts rewritten. Payments rerouted. Names removed and reinserted under different identifiers. The waitress watched it silently, her fingers still resting on the edge of the counter where she had stood for every version of herself that had been ignored. "They used my shifts to cover debt routing," she said softly. "That's why every time I helped someone, it disappeared afterward." The boss didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the system map on the lawyer's screen, tracing lines that extended beyond the diner, beyond the street, beyond anything visible from inside it. Then he said, quieter than before, "This didn't start here." The supervisor finally moved toward the exit, but two staff members, no longer hesitant, stepped into his path. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just positioned. The realization of containment arrived before the physical stopping did. The waitress didn't look at him. She wasn't watching punishment. She was watching acknowledgement finally begin to exist in a place that had denied it for so long. The boss turned slightly toward her. "You didn't lose $18, he said. "You exposed a system that measures people in missing minutes." There was no dramatic collapse. No sudden apology that fixed everything. Instead, there was process, cold, structured, irreversible. The diner manager was escorted out under documented violation of financial manipulation and identity alteration protocols. The ledger system was flagged for federal review. The altered shift logs were preserved, not erased, now evidence instead of invisibility. Hours later, when the room emptied and the machines were turned down, the waitress stood alone behind the counter. The apron that had once carried system stains was cleaned. Not replaced, not discarded, but washed until the mark no longer remained. She held it for a moment under the soft kitchen light, then tied it around her waist again. The boss stood near the door, watching without intrusion. No words passed for several seconds. Only the sound of the building settling after being forced to tell the truth. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the same folded $18 bill. It was no longer evidence. It was just paper again. She placed it inside the apron pocket. Not as loss, not as burden, but as something finally returned to its meaning. "I just didn't want them to take it first," she said quietly. The boss didn't respond immediately. He only looked at her for a long moment, as if understanding something he had spent years not noticing in anyone. The diner lights hummed overhead, steady now, instead of flickering. Outside, the SUVs began to leave one by one, not in pursuit, but in resolution. And in the quiet that remained, the waitress poured a cup of coffee, set it on the counter, and for the first time since the night began, no one tried to rewrite the moment she was standing in.